Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. I am so excited for this one because we're going to be diving into the world of hand gestures today.
Oh, wow.
Yes. So, you know those things you do with your hands when you talk?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out they can actually change how people understand what you're saying.
Hmm.
Yeah, no kidding. It all started with this research paper you sent over about the connection between hand gestures and speech perception.
Right.
And get this. The researchers used a computer-animated character, like an avatar, to try and isolate the impact of hand movements on how we understand sentences.
Interesting.
And let me tell you, some of their findings are pretty wild. Like, you might be shocked by how much a simple gesture can change the meaning of a sentence.
I can imagine.
It's really incredible. So let's start with the big question. How much do hand gestures really contribute to how we understand language? I mean, why do we even gesture in the first place? Like, think about it. People gesture even when they're on the phone and the other person can't see them.
It's true. It's almost like we can't help ourselves.
Right. So clearly something's going on there. And there are actually a couple of main theories about how gestures and speech evolved together. One theory is that gestures actually came first.
Okay.
So the idea is that our ancestors were basically miming things out to each other way back when, before they actually had language.
So like a silent movie, but with more grunting.
Exactly. But then there's another theory that says gestures and speech developed together, side by side.
Interesting.
Like they were partners in crime from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Based on this research, does one of those theories seem more likely?
Well, it's tough to say for sure. This particular study focused on the perception of speech when it's accompanied by gestures, not the production side of things.
I see.
So it's more about how our brains take in and process that combined information.
That makes sense. So it's not about why we gesture, but how those gestures actually affect what we hear and understand.
Right. Like, have you ever noticed how powerful pointing is?
Oh, absolutely. Like if you point at something and say, look at that.
Yeah.
It's crystal clear what you're talking about.
Exactly. It's like pointing is its own language.
Right. It's almost instinctual.
And that's called ostensive specification.
Ostensive specification.
Yeah, it's a fancy way of saying that pointing helps to ground the meaning of what we're saying in the real world. And it's not just humans that understand it either.
You're right. Even animals seem to get the concept of pointing.
It's pretty fascinating.
It is. And that actually makes me think about some of the other stuff you're into, like, you know, how we learn and communicate with each other, even across species.
Yeah.
But pointing isn't the only kind of gesture out there, is it?
No, not at all. There are all kinds of gestures. Some are iconic, meaning they actually look like the thing they're representing.
Okay.
Like if you're talking about a phone,
Yeah.
you might hold your hand up to your ear.
Right.
And then you have metaphoric gestures where you use your hands to represent an abstract idea. Like, you know, if you're talking about a big problem, you might spread your hands wide apart. And then there are delictic gestures, which are basically pointing gestures that direct attention to a specific location. And then there are beat gestures.
Beat gestures. Okay, I'm not familiar with those. What are those?
So imagine you're having a conversation and you're making small movements with your hands, almost like you're keeping time with the rhythm of your speech.
Oh, okay.
Those are beat gestures, not depicting anything specific, but they can emphasize certain parts of what you're saying.
So like when you're really getting into a story and your hands start moving all over the place?
Exactly. And this study focused specifically on these simple beat gestures to see how their timing affects what people hear.
Fascinating.
Yeah. They used that computer-animated character we were talking about earlier, and they programmed it to say a specific phrase, put the book there now, while making a beat gesture with its hand.
Wait, so the character wasn't pointing or anything, just moving its hand up and down?
That's right. Just a simple rhythmic movement. And to make things even more interesting, they took away the natural ups and downs in the character's voice. They made it sound really flat and robotic.
Okay, but why would they do that? Wouldn't that just make it harder to understand?
That was exactly the point. By removing the natural emphasis in the voice, they could be sure that any change in how people perceived the sentence was due to the timing of the gesture and not the way the words were spoken.
So it's like they isolated the power of the gesture itself.
Precisely.
Clever. So how did they actually set up the experiment? Were people just watching this avatar talk?
Well, it gets even more interesting. Sometimes they showed the avatar with a table in the background.
A table?
Yeah.
Why a table?
Well, it all comes down to this idea of environmental affordances.
Yeah.
Basically, an affordance is what an object allows you to do with it.
So, like, A chair affords sitting.
Exactly. And a table, well, it affords placing things on it.
Okay, I see.
So they wanted to see if having that table there, an object you could potentially interact with, would change how people interpreted the sentence, especially when combined with that beat gesture.
Hold on. You're telling me that just by adding a table to the scene, they thought they could change which word people heard as emphasized?
Yep. They were basically testing whether our brains automatically link certain actions with certain objects, even if those actions aren't explicitly stated.
Wow. That's wild. Did it actually work?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into next.
Okay, now I'm really hooked. I need to know what happened.
So, before the break, we were talking about how even simple hand movements can change how we understand speech.
It really is mind-blowing. And you were just about to tell us what they found out about the table. Did adding a table to the scene actually change anything?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So remember how they were tracking which word people perceived as emphasized in the sentence? Well, just having that table in the background made people way more likely to hear there as the emphasized word, especially when the avatar's gesture happened at the same time as the word there.
No way. You're telling me just adding a random table to the background can shift how people understand a whole sentence?
Yep. And it shows just how much our brains are taking in information from our surroundings, even without us realizing it. It's like our environment becomes part of the conversation too.
Huh, that's interesting. So it goes back to that affordances idea you mentioned earlier, right?
Exactly. Like a chair is for sitting and a table is for
putting things on it.
Right. So when you see a table and hear the phrase, put the book there, your brain just automatically connects there with the table.
Even if nobody actually says to put the book on the table.
Exactly. It's all happening subconsciously. But, okay, are you ready for the really juicy stuff?
Oh, lay it on me. What else did they find?
So they were super interested in the timing of the gestures, right?
Yeah.
And they discovered something they called perceived synchrony regions. PSRs for short.
PSRs. Okay, what are those?
Basically, they're like little windows of time where a gesture has the biggest influence on which word we hear as emphasized.
Interesting. So it's not just about making a gesture, it's about when you do it.
Exactly. Think of it like a conductor leading an orchestra. You know how their movements tell the musicians when to play certain notes louder or softer?
Oh yeah, I get it. So the timing of the gesture is kind of like a conductor's baton guiding us through the sentence.
You got it. And here's the really crazy part.
Yeah.
They found people could hear a word as emphasized even before it was spoken. Like if the gesture happened just a split second before the word.
Whoa, hold on. Are you saying our brains are predicting what's going to be said based on the gesture? That's insane.
Yeah, our brains are constantly trying to stay one step ahead. We don't just passively listen. We're always making predictions and building meaning from all these little cues.
This is blowing my mind. It's like there's a whole hidden conversation happening between our gestures and our words.
Right. And that can be really helpful when things get tricky. Like imagine you're trying to understand someone in a noisy room or someone with a strong accent.
Oh yeah, you really have to pay attention to body language in this situation.
Exactly. Gestures give us that extra layer of information that helps us fill in the gaps.
This is also fascinating. I'm definitely going to be watching people's hand movements a lot closer from now on. Okay, so we're back, and I have to say my mind is still spinning from all this gesture stuff. It's crazy how much we do with our hands without even thinking about it.
I know, right? I feel like I'm going to be hyper aware of every hand movement from now on.
Me too. But before we wrap things up, I wanted to touch back on something you said earlier about how this research changes how we think about communication.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's like you were saying, it's not just about the words that come out of our mouths. It's about this whole orchestra of cues. And gestures are a much bigger part of that than I think most people realize.
Totally. And you know what's interesting to think about? Like, if gestures are so important, are we actually using them strategically when we talk? Mm-hmm. Or are our hands just doing their own thing?
That's a good question. I know I've caught myself gesturing more when I'm trying to explain something complicated.
Right.
Like maybe my hands are trying to help me get the point across or something.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It makes me think about situations where being clear and easily understood is super important, like a surgeon explaining a procedure to their team.
Oh, yeah, or a pilot talking to air traffic control. You wouldn't want any miscommunication there.
Not at all. In those kind of high-stakes situations, clear communication could be the difference between, success and disaster.
For sure. Which I guess really highlights how important it is to be aware of all these nonverbal cues.
Right. And it makes you wonder if there are, cultural differences in how people use gestures.
That's a good point.
and how that might lead to misunderstandings.
It would be fascinating to see more research on that.
Totally. There's so much more we could learn. But, okay, speaking of more research, how cool would it be if we could apply this stuff to technology?
What do you mean?
Like, imagine if our virtual assistants or our smartphones could understand our gestures as well as our words.
Oh, wow. That would be amazing.
Right. It would make interacting with technology so much more natural and intuitive.
Totally. Imagine controlling your computer with just a wave of your hand.
Exactly. Or think about virtual reality.
Yeah.
What if you could use gestures to interact with virtual objects? It would make the whole experience even more immersive and realistic.
That would be incredible. It feels like there are so many exciting possibilities.
Yeah,
here.
the potential is huge.
Yeah.
And really just goes to show even something as simple as a hand gesture can have a profound impact on how we communicate and interact with the world around us.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a truly mind-bending deep dive. We've covered so much ground today, from the evolution of gestures to their role in speech perception, and even explored some really cool potential applications.
It's been a blast. I'm definitely leaving with a newfound appreciation for the power of hand movements.
Me too. And we hope you are too. So for all you listeners out there, we have a little challenge for you. Pay closer attention to your own gestures and to the gestures of the people you interact with. You might be surprised by what you notice.
And if you have any interesting research you'd like us to take a deep dive into, send it our way. We're always looking for new topics to explore.
That's right. We love uncovering hidden gems of knowledge and sharing them with you all. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those hands talking.